Hi, and welcome to Raw Politique, where we engage with the most critical issues shaping the world today. Boy, have we a treat for you today with the brilliant historian and journalist Vijay Prashad. However, before we chat with Vijay, just a reminder that you can check out a plethora of our other brilliant guests enjoyed on Raw Politique thus far, including former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and the fearless and unfiltered Roger Waters.
There was a time when even to mention the word Palestine in Parliament was seen as deeply controversial, even though it had been on British colonial maps in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and other places. We've now reached a situation where it is culturally cool and appropriate to be pro-Palestinian, and that has got to be a good thing.
I wouldn't wipe my feet on Keir Starmer. He's a disgusting human being. That is why he's written to the top of the Labour Party, because there's something weirdly attractive about lying. It's the way politics works. If you could lie, pretend, and do all of that, and stab people in the back, it's really important, and collude with the ruling class.
Plus, be sure to tune in for a Raw Politics special where we tackle the sensitive issue that is the politics of sport, which features an exclusive interview with former England and Man City footballer Joey Barton. Here's a little taster.
You're emotionally connected to the world. You know, you see things happening around you, and you pass comment on them. And for me, I'm a working class boy off a council estate in Liverpool who was good at a sport. And I'm surprised really lots of the time when some of the things I say, have the impact they do and garner the traction that they do, to the point where, it makes kind of media headlines, or there's debates on TV shows or radio shows, or even, politicians, are either condemning you or getting involved in some of the things you've said.
Our chat with Joey Barton will also include something of an explosive reveal, so be sure to stay tuned. Okay, back to today's guest. My guest is Vijay Prashad, a historian, journalist, and the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He has authored several influential books, including The Darker Nations, The Poorer Nations, and Washington Bullets. His work provides a comprehensive critique of imperialism, global power structures, and the continuing struggles of the global South. Vijay's insights are deeply informed by history, resistance movements, and the call for justice. Vijay, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Reluctantly, I'm going to kick off the show with Trump. I'd love it if you could talk to us a little bit about the new tariff plan and what you think the consequences of that is going to be, and the U.S. withdrawal of foreign aid.
Well, the first thing to understand about Donald Trump is that he is not a clown. He is not a buffoon. He represents a very serious seam of American politics, which is an American nationalism, America firstism. What he says, you have to understand and believe what he says. Indeed, I don't believe that like his moves on Ukraine are, about peace or some bumbling innocence, or that he's a Russian agent. It's very clear what he's doing. What he's doing is something that I think of as the reverse Kissinger strategy. What he's doing is he's taking Henry Kissinger's understanding of world affairs and putting it on its head. Henry Kissinger in the 1960s made the argument the most dangerous thing for US power would be the unity of China and Russia, or at the time, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. So Kissinger was interested in splitting China from Russia. And the way he did it was the Kissinger strategy: befriend China, isolate the Soviet Union, isolate Russia. And that's exactly what he did. He opened, through Pakistan, secret talks with the Chinese. Richard Nixon goes to China in 1972, and the United States has its Kissinger strategy. Trump, since his first term, has been following the reverse Kissinger, which is befriend Russia and isolate China. And the reason they're doing this is because the Trump administration recognizes that previous US administrations have erroneously attempted to isolate both Russia and China and have therefore brought the two closer together. Secondly, what the Trump administration recognizes correctly is that Russia is in fact not a threat to the United States, not to its power. It's merely an exporter of raw materials, natural gas and oil. Whereas China is an existential threat to US domination because China has improved its productive forces and it's an exporter of high-tech goods. In fact, out of 64 critical technologies, China is ahead of the United States in 55 of them, 55 out of 64. So Trump's plan is tariff everybody who doesn't get in line, tariff everybody who's getting close to the Chinese, go after the Panamanians, they're getting close to the Chinese, expand the US military footprint to threaten China, befriend Russia, and isolate the Chinese so that then they surrender their technological advancements. That's the Trump agenda. It's not as stupid as it seems. The problem is it relies on Trump being able to drive a hard cultural agenda about white supremacy, Christianity, anti-homosexuality that he hopes will appeal to a part of the Russian population and draw them into a kind of white Christian alliance against the Chinese. This is the hope. I don't know if this is going to work. I think the Russians have been burnt by the West and are not so easily going to reverse gear and break their ties with the Chinese because they know that what the West is interested in doing is China first, Russia next. That's as far as Trump is concerned. And I really would caution people not to be so dismissive about Trump's policies, because in fact, there is a method to the madness.
Yeah, I think the question is, are there any limits to what he will do? I'm curious to hear your view on the US position on Taiwan, which seems to have taken a shift. Also, your thoughts on India. We've seen that the Indian government has obviously sided with the Zionists during this latest genocide. Just curious to hear your opinion on both of those.
Yeah, let's start with the Taiwan issue. I mean, you know, the United States, when Nixon went to China in 1972, made an adjustment of its policy regarding Taiwan. Until that period, the United Nations seat for China was held by the Republic of China, or in other words, Taiwan. But then Taiwan was removed from that seat and the seat was given to the People's Republic of China. That was with US assent. In fact, the United States recognizes there's only one China and that Beijing is its capital. This is the official US policy. But the United States slyly kept the door open in 1977 with the Taiwan Relations Act by saying, well, we'll also kind of acknowledge that Taiwan is not exactly under Chinese jurisdiction. This is the duplicity of US policy. And every time they want to sort of tighten the screws on Beijing, they go and do something with Taiwan. They, in fact, play a game with Taiwan. This is not sincere to the Taiwanese either. In recent period, in order to turn the screws up against Beijing, the United States has been playing this Taiwan game quite aggressively. But interesting, Mr. Trump has moved considerably from his first term when he surrounded himself with idealist hawks like John Bolton, who just want to go to war with everybody. And he's got closer to the realists in the right-wing foreign policy world, including Elbridge Colby, the grandson of William Colby, who used to be the head of the CIA. Mr. Elbridge Colby is most likely going to be the number 2 in the Department of Defense. Mr. Colby is a realist. I mean, he understands that US policy regarding Iran, for instance, shouldn't be obsessed with the nuclear weapons, because he says even if Iran has a nuclear weapon, it's merely defensive, like North Korea. They wouldn't have the guts or the brains to fire it because they would be obliterated. Why would Iran use its nuclear weapons? Crazy. So he's a realist. He's sort of game theoried the situation, said, let them have it. In the same way, Mr. Colby sees China as the principal existential threat to US power. They're quite interested in sort of playing this Taiwan screw as much as possible, but also using it as a carrot, saying that, well, we could withdraw the Taiwan screw and say it's Chinese as a reward if China decides to do something. So in fact, the Taiwanese people's benefit, their welfare is no concern of the US administration. They're just playing a game. If we come to India, here, Mary, it's quite interesting because, in fact, the Indian government during the genocide of the Palestinians since October the 7th of 2023 didn't ever say we recognize Israel's right to defend itself. They never said that. In fact, interestingly, right through this period, India kept reasonably quiet, the government. After the genocide continued, and when the issue of what is going to happen to Gaza was raised, India echoed China in saying that the two-state solution is sacrosanct, cannot be played with. And that's interesting because obviously, I don't believe that the two-state solution is any longer a plausible solution, but it's important for countries like India and of course China to insist on the two-state solution now to prevent the annexation of Gaza, to prevent the annexation of the occupied Palestinian territory in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. I think that's the only reason why it's important for them to say, to prevent an annexationist policy. So India has been playing an interesting game, in fact, and I've been looking at this carefully. Why hasn't India come out and embraced Mr. Netanyahu? Why hasn't Modi gone to Tel Aviv and embraced Mr. Netanyahu? And the reason I think is that despite Modi's current visit to Washington and his embrace of Trump and so on, that India is trying to create its own foreign policy, space, so that during the period of intense pressure from the West for India to break ties with Russia and to stop buying Russian oil, India refused and said, we have our own foreign policy. And I think now Mr. Modi is embracing Mr. Trump, because if Trump is going to make a peace deal in Ukraine and settle things with the Russians, then that sort of reduces the tension between Washington and India. And maybe then India will say, we embrace Mr. Netanyahu. But in this period, in fact, India has sort of been more along the BRICS line than, fully we embrace Mr. Netanyahu. But I wouldn't put too much on this, as I say, that if tomorrow the US and Russia even out their relationship, India might, go back on side with the US and therefore be more embracing of the Israelis, who are getting away with the genocide, okay? They're getting away with it. Nobody is being held accountable for it.
No, not yet. Hopefully at some point. I'm just curious to ask you two things, because you mentioned BRICS. Can we discuss BRICS as a real alternative? Do you see it potentially as becoming a real force for economic decolonization at some point?
Well, the BRICS is an interesting project. It starts in 2009, maybe just a year before the negotiations begin. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Western banking system, these countries like China, India, Brazil, very large countries, they had relied on the US market. They were selling things to the US market, European market. They saw the United States as the buyer of last resort. And they suddenly got a shock in 2007. Like, oh my God, our principal customer is not going to be able to buy from us anymore. And so at that point, these countries started to think, let's intensify our trade with each other, a sort of South-South commerce, and let's find new markets. So you get the BRICS set up in 2009. Few years later, China opens up its Belt and Road Initiative. First, it was called One Belt, One Road. Effectively, to pivot away from reliance on the US market. It had a very, very, very modest goal, okay? This wasn't to be some major political force, you can't overestimate what the BRICS was. Also, the BRICS relies on who's in power in countries like Brazil and India. When Bolsonaro was in power, Jair Bolsonaro, far-right guy in power in Brazil, BRICS sort of saw Brazil reverse outward. Brazil, kind of almost didn't participate that much. But in the BRICS institutions, you had Bolsonaro appointees sitting there. Now you have a far-right government in India, the government of Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi's people are directors of the New Development Bank, the so-called BRICS Bank. They operate in the Contingency Reserve Agreement and so on. So it's not like the BRICS is without a political, anchor that is anchored in these countries. So, for instance, Dilma Rousseff, the director of the New Development Bank, BRICS Bank, has terrific ideas about local currency trade and so on. But she has to, manage a bank where one of the directors is the Indian director who won't allow the BRICS Bank to break fully with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank because they have their own entanglements. So one shouldn't, look at BRICS and go, wow, this is a big, break and so on. You have to understand that there are institutional compulsions. BRICS would not have been as strong as it is now without Brazil, without India. But Brazil and India have also been, in a sense, the drags on BRICS. Whereas, South Africa, for most of the time, is quite willing to try to build new procedures, new institutions, new ways to transact money and so on. Especially now, Trump is going after South Africa, sanctions South Africa. They will need new systems of money transfer and so on. India still quite, quote unquote, conservative about breaking with the old institutions. Conservative in that sense that they don't want to allow the BRICS institutions to innovate too much because they are still sort of caught in a US framework of how the world should be organized.
Right. I mean, they want to see where they can benefit the most. They want to see how they can get, their bread buttered. But I'm just thinking more broadly, zooming out from the economic side of things, like, is this a moment for the global South? You've seen South Africa, take the Zionist entity to the ICJ and so on. Like, do you think this is a moment where countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia are asserting themselves more forcefully against Western dominance? Is this the moment?
Well, in our institute, Tricontinental, which I direct, we use a phrase to describe this. We call this the new mood in the global South. We think there's a new mood, okay? Partly, Mary, I'm very careful about exaggerating changes, because you need the most accurate understanding of the world. Otherwise, you can't live in it. If you begin to yell and scream about multipolarity and this and that, you're not getting the full picture. We don't live in a multipolar world, okay? The United States dominates the world militarily. 74.3% of global military spending is spent by the NATO plus countries. China spends 10% of the world's military budget, Russia 4%. Everybody else is tiny percentages, yeah? 74.3%, the US can bomb anybody, anywhere, which is why, for instance, Iran right now is cautious, very cautious, was cautious when the US and the Israelis, so viciously bombed southern Lebanon, assassinated Syed Hassan Nasrallah. The Israelis were given carte blanche by the Americans, and the Iranians couldn't really respond because they do not want Tehran to be flattened. That's what the Americans are capable of doing. They showed it to us how they treated Iraq. They showed it to us how they treated Libya. They showed us how little concern they have for the people with their behavior in Syria. The attitude of the US isn't let's worry about the Syrian people. It's what's the best geopolitical arrangement for our interests and so on. It's very silly for people to think or to believe US spokespeople when they say we're concerned about the Syrian people. Really, we watch how you treat immigrants into the country. You are deporting people left, right, and center. You don't care about the migrants. Germany, we care about the Syrians. Really, I don't see it. I don't see tangible evidence of concern. Anyway, let's not get distracted by that. The point of the matter is that we don't live in a world which is being fractured. We still live in a world where US power is pretty commanding. The way the United States and Israel have reshaped West Asia is incredible. I mean, the way in which the Europeans, United States helped Israel deeply damage Hamas. Hamas is not destroyed, but it's deeply damaged. How they deeply damaged Hezbollah, how they provided air cover for the Idlib rebels to come into Damascus, overthrow the government of Mr. Bashar al-Assad. How they weakened the Arab world to such an extent that the king of Jordan goes to Trump's office and sits there quivering, quivering. Physically, he looked ill. I was worried for his health. He seemed ill sitting there. They are put in a very difficult position. Tomorrow, Syria might recognize Israel. Day after, Lebanon might do the same. The new government in Lebanon, the United States sends their envoy. She openly, in a press conference, standing next to heads of government of Lebanon, says, we will not permit Hezbollah to enter the government. I mean, this is direct interference in Lebanese politics. So the point I'm making is, let's not exaggerate the changes. Nonetheless, there is a new mood in the global South. This new mood comes because many countries, in Africa, in Latin America, the way that Gustavo Petro of Colombia has been able to operate, this is partly because they do not any longer rely on the International Monetary Fund. When they need investment, they go to China. When they need inputs, they go to Indonesia. There is Vietnam. There are other countries, industrial powerhouses that can help them out. They are not reliant on the United States, so they can stand up to it, which is why you had the Hague Group forming, in outside the International Court of Justice, because they now are confident that anyway they are getting sanctioned, anyway they're getting pilloried by the Americans, there are alternatives, the Chinese in the lead to provide the alternatives. That affords a new mood, but it's not multipolarity.
Mm. I love that you're giving an accurate assessment of the global South and whether this is the moment or not. Can you also give an accurate assessment of the left today? And do you see any hope?
Yeah, I mean, this is a much longer and, for me personally, a very painful story, because you see, the left has a natural constituency, which is the constituency of workers and peasants, people who work in factories, people who work in fields and shops and so on, workers and peasants, the natural constituency. Ever since the era of globalization opened up, we have seen a serious decline of trade union membership, both in factories and in agriculture. Labor contracts have been revised in such a horrendous way, that most workers around the world work precariously. They work precariously in the sense that they don't have fixed hours. They have, in fact, no fixed employer. The Uberization of work has taken place in many fields. No, it's not just Uber drivers. In fact, Uberization, going through the app to get a job, predates Uber. Before Uber, people used to stand on a street corner and wait for a truck to come by and hire them for the day laborers. It's a form of Uberization of labor. They're day laborers. If they want to have union rights, don't hire them the next day. They're gone. So the structural condition for unionization has declined globally. And so workers and peasants have been atomized, have been alienated from each other. They are not in communities of solidarity. Old union halls which provided working class culture have been destroyed, no longer in existence in working class communities. Instead, you have many more religious buildings funded by richer people who are providing the kind of services that trade unions used to provide. So rather than a working class identity, people are much more liable to have religious or ethnic identities, because this is the kind of vertical organization of society. Rich Christians funding churches in poor neighborhoods are vertically organizing society rather than the horizontal organization of people, say, as workers or as peasants and so on. That culture has been eroded. And you have much more horizontal communities inside the neighborhoods of the poor. And we see a kind of wretched appearance of horizontal politics, what people sometimes loosely call populism. But horizontal politics, Latin America, the emergence of Pentecostal churches, for instance, has created voting blocks of people who vote on issues such as, women's reproductive health. They are against abortion. That becomes the principal issue. The Pentecostal church says this is what we are interested in. So they end up voting for a right-wing zealot, like Javier Milei in Argentina, whose base comes from here. It is a working class base. Same with Mr. Trump. There are working class voters, but they're not voting as a working class. They are voting as perhaps Orthodox Christians, or they are voting as Christian Zionists, some of them, and so on. So this reconstruction of the mass of society has put the left at a huge disadvantage. And I think I'm, again, not going to, bang a drum and say, well, it's just a matter of trying harder. I think structurally something has to give. There are lots of attempts by precarious workers to organize themselves, sometimes in their neighborhoods. They just don't have water. So they are organizing now as neighbors, not as workers, but they are building horizontal communities. And I think there will be a shift, but it's going to take time.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about parties like in the UK, like the Labour Party, that are supposed to represent the working class, but now have become completely authoritarian and neoliberal zealots like Keir Starmer, of course, a human rights barrister who forgot what human rights are. We've had our dear friend Roger Waters, who's a huge fan of yours, talk about Keir Starmer, and recently we've seen Keir Starmer talking about how he wants to deport Gazans who have used a legislation that allows Ukrainians to come in. I mean, just complete hypocrisy. Can you talk a little bit about the state of UK politics today?
Well, I was just in London and I did a couple of events with the very, very great Jeremy Corbyn, who would have made a terrific Prime Minister of Britain. Although, I mean, imagine being Jeremy in the Prime Minister's chair. What a life he would have had to lead. Okay, the hands he'd have to shake and so on. Hey, it's a different question. You as the head of government, you have to embrace all. You'd have to go to Washington and imagine those briefings. What would they be like? Such a sincere, decent, and bright man. Really, the way the Labour Party has treated him is emblematic of its own decline. To first accuse Jeremy Corbyn, of all people, of anti-Semitism is absolutely ridiculous. The man has not one bone of bigotry in his body. To accuse him, it's ridiculous. He stood up against all forms of xenophobia, discrimination. He stands for all people who are weakened and who have struggled and so on. I just find it so hard to talk about UK politics without thinking first about what was done to the people who also followed him, who were inspired to enter politics and so on. Wretched treatment of that enormous base of people. Not only Mr. Starmer, but the entire Labour Party should be ashamed of itself for how it had behaved and how it continues to behave. Anyway, okay, that said, British politics is a mess. British politics is a mess because Britain, once again, has a working class that has been quite severely precaritized. And it has old working class communities who have been forgotten. The old cutlery factories of Sheffield and, up in the Midlands, all the towns that brought in workers from India after Indian independence to come and work in the factories and drive the buses and whatnot. Whether it's Leicester all the way out to Sheffield, that belt of towns in the UK, they've been forgotten. I mean, nobody is out there trying to build a project for them. The project is for a small section of elites in the city of London. That was Blairism. Blairism was the middle class, educated at the top schools, who would have a top, the kind of the thought industries were the ones privileged, the bankers and lawyers and this and that. But the workers, not privileged at all. They were set aside. And what happens is that, as I was describing, rather than build horizontal politics, because trade unions declined in England deeply, you get now these vertical silos of politics. And one of the most powerful vertical silos was Brexit. When the Brexiteers came and said, look, your problems are the migrants coming from Poland. I mean, let's be honest, Brexit was an anti-Eastern European project. It wasn't really, I mean, it's not like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson thought about reindustrializing Britain. They don't have an industrial policy. They don't even know what an industrial policy would look like. Their viewpoint was entirely framed in anti-immigrant terms, and not the immigrants we are thinking of, but really Eastern Europeans. I mean, they would talk about who is your plumber, some Eastern European fellow in a tracksuit. I mean, this is the attitude of the Brexiteers. Well, okay, fair enough. Again, you've built a vertical silo of politics, and that creates an electoral constituency so that Mr. Farage, can now challenge the Conservatives at their game, and might make enormous advances in the next election. Who knows? Already has made enormous advances. So my point is, British politics actually is a microcosm of politics in many parts of the global South. Because, let's face it, it's been a long time since Britain has been a player in the world. It's sort of dragged along by the United States. In many respects, British politics are closer to things that are happening in Asia, Africa, Latin America than they are, even to the situation in the United States.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we are huge fans of Jeremy Corbyn. So you can talk about him as much as you like. He's a dear friend of mine from years ago, and we've had him on the show. So thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. One of the other themes that we talk about on Raw Politik a lot is the role of independent media. I mean, we're an independent media station. I'm wondering, do you think we're seeing a shift in how power operates in the media? Or do you think that sort of Western mainstream media still has the monopoly on global storytelling?
I'm sorry to say that they still have a monopoly on storytelling, because papers around the world, whether it's in Amman, Jordan, or it's in New Delhi, India, or Santiago in Chile, reflect the Associated Press, Reuters. They sometimes just draw their international news from CNN or from Fox News, whether it's Fox en Espanol or it's Fox in English and so on. I mean, you pick up a newspaper, pick up a paper in the Arab world, for instance. Let's say you go and read Al Arabiya. The chances are, if they have a story on India, it's from Reuters. That's the high chance. It's not from RT or CGTN, or it's not from you and me. That's one thing we need to consider, that we have to create alternatives, definitely. I generally feel like that you and I are neither independent journalists nor alternative journalists. We are journalists. We are the real thing. We are the real journalists. We are the people who want to cover the world, telling compelling stories about the world. We are interested in being as accurate as possible, because people need an accurate view of the world in order to survive it, to fight in it, to build whatever they want to build in it. If somebody has a child coming up to them and says, Mom, Dad, what shall I do for my life? The parents need an accurate understanding of the world to talk to their children. That's what we do journalism for. We want to help people guide their way, as a guide through the complexities in the world. That's what journalism is for. It's not just for reporting, the big things. I believe that we report the great processes of our time. We don't just report, the story of the moment. I used to joke when I taught writing classes that, the great story, car hits deer, deer dies. They tell the story of the car. We are interested in the deer. The real journalist says, who was the deer? Not why did the car hit the deer? I mean, that's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. I'm interested in the deer. I'm interested in the deer and why the car hit the deer. The great process of our time. I'm interested in the stories of ordinary people. I'm interested in the stories of Palestinians. I'm interested in how the Palestinians engineered the biggest Israeli intelligence failure in recent memory. And you may not know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about October 7th. The biggest intelligence failure from the Israelis was the day that thousands of Palestinians left southern Gaza and marched to the north. And the Israelis were caught unawares. You know, the Palestinians marched in their hundreds, in groups and groups. They had drones flying above. It was completely planned. There were young Palestinian men mainly climbing up poles with Palestinian flags to be filmed by the drones. They were welcomed by Hamas as they came into Gaza City. That was a complete intelligence failure by the Israelis. You know, now the Israelis can say we want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, or the Americans can say we'll bulldoze everything, build Trump International Resort and Tower in Gaza. Sorry, guys, if you're going to have to do that, you're going to have to conduct another genocide because the Palestinians are back in Gaza City. You're going to have to throw them away. I mean, the reason it's an intelligence failure is had the Israelis known this was happening, they would have blocked the road with tanks somewhere south of Khan Yunis. They didn't know it was coming, and they didn't know it was so well planned. This is incredible. I mean, I was extremely moved to see these ordinary Palestinians. You know, these are not militants, fighters, members of any faction, just walking back home, you know, greeting relatives and so on. Everything very well filmed, very well planned. You know, whoever planned that, I salute you. You caught the Israelis unawares. You caught the Americans unawares. Trump cannot create a Riviera in Gaza without a second genocide because these brave people marched back to Gaza City.
No, thank you for bringing up that moment. I mean, I think for those of us here who are Palestinian, you know, seeing that day was momentous, right? I mean, you're seeing people return, unlike the Nakba in 1948, where we didn't return. You see people returning, and I think that that gave a lot of people hope. I mean, my Instagram was just, you know, this great march back to the north. But, you know, honestly, I also was fearful because you know what people are going back to. I mean, there's nothing left, and you know that there's another prospect of the genocide continuing. So since you brought that up, I'd love to hear about what you think is actually going to happen. I mean, it's been declared that Trump and the Zionists want to ethnically cleanse the West Bank. I mean, they've been saying that for a decade. So how do you see things unfolding in occupied Palestine?
Well, look, frankly speaking, it's a very bad balance of forces. The balance of forces are tipped against the Palestinians. I'm going to say a couple of things which I may come to regret, but you know, I like our conversation, so I'm just going to say it. I think I'd like to send a message to President Sisi of Egypt, just a historical message. In 1948, when King Farouk was the king of Egypt, you know, they had spent a lot of money, a lot of Egyptian treasury building up the Egyptian army in the years before 1948. The Egyptian army was sitting in their bases in 1948, watching the Nakba happen. And when they eventually went into Gaza, in fact, to go in and garrison Gaza, the Egyptian forces found that the Egyptian monarchy had wasted their money buying subpar material for fighting. Very bad tanks, very bad equipment, and so on. And in fact, it is because of that Gamal Abdel Nasser and others got together and created the Free Officers Movement and then led the coup d'etat against King Farouk in 1952. My message to Mr. Sisi, who not once during the genocide even uttered the word no-fly zone. I mean, what's the point of the Egyptian Air Force spending all this money to buy top-of-the-line US military aircraft? What is the point? And what is the point of the United Nations having a responsibility to protect doctrine, which was exercised maliciously by NATO in Libya, where they used the term no-fly zone? What's the point of all this? If the Egyptian government didn't even once utter the phrase responsibility to protect, no-fly zone, not once did the Egyptian prime minister use this phrase, the foreign minister or the president. I would caution President Sisi that the Egyptian army has a history, and the history was demonstrated in 1952. Is somebody in Egypt today capable of being the new Nasser? So that's number one, to change the balance of forces. I would also caution people in other countries, including in Jordan, where I thought the Queen of Jordan, Queen Rania, was extremely eloquent twice on Christian Amanpour's television show. Twice. She went twice. She was extremely eloquent. She spoke for hundreds of millions of people around the world, not only her own Palestinian community, but hundreds of millions of people around the world. She spoke so eloquently. I hope that her husband at some point is going to register that his legacy should not crumble, in the ruins of Gaza. That really they need to stand up. And if these countries don't stand up, including the Iraqi government, if these countries don't stand up and say something, I mean, Mr. Ahmad Shara, the current president or whatever he is, interim of Syria, used to go by the nom de guerre of Al-Jolani, named after the Golan Heights. He took the name Golan Heights. If he doesn't have the guts to continue to claim the Golan Heights for Syria, what kind of leader of Syria? This is a real decline from the great leaders of Syria in the 1940s and 50s. This is a real decline, if they are going to cut a deal. And Lebanon, there's going to be the funeral of Syed Hassan Nasrallah. I mean, Lebanon must not be permitted to cut a peace agreement with Israel, because this is just going to destroy the balance of forces. And the last thing I would say is to the Gulf Arab states. I mean, the United Arab Emirates joined the Abraham Accords and now has welcomed an Israeli ambassador. In this moment, when Gaza is in ruins, he's embracing the Israeli ambassador. Is this the moment to welcome an Israeli ambassador to the United Arab Emirates? What is the situation in Saudi Arabia? Where is Mohammed bin Salman with his independent foreign policy? Is he going to go back onto the ship in the Suez Canal and sit with the Americans and break bread and bow to them again? Or is he going to hold his head up high and defend the Palestinian people? I mean, really, Mary, the question you asked me is not just about the different factions in Palestine, what will Hamas do? This is about the Arab people. I'm sorry to say it in an ethnic way like this, but this is about the Arab people. A people that have, since the 1930s, stood with the Palestinians, crumbling, their fortitude crumbling. We've seen it crumble in Morocco, crumbling in Libya, crumbling in Tunisia. Algeria still holding fast. But where are the Arabs? That's the question. Where is the Arab League? Silent on this genocide. They were so anxious to be involved in the war in Syria. So quickly they expelled the Syrian government and so on. Where is the Arab League? I would challenge any of your viewers to put down on a piece of paper the name of the Secretary General of the Arab League. Okay, to put the name of the Secretary General of the Arab League, close it, put it to a side, and then Google and to see if you have the name correctly. I bet you the average viewer, zero chance of knowing who's the Secretary General of the Arab League, because the person has been silent during this genocide. Shameful, shameful that the Arab League has been silent.
I mean, I think you would agree with me. The distinction here is between, the Arab sort of regimes, the client regimes versus the people here. And that leads me to my next question, which is, we consider ourselves part of sort of this liberation movement that we see unfolding and this global solidarity movement. So looking at the history of decolonization and revolutionary movements of the 20th century, what lessons do you think we can apply not only to the Palestinian movement, but to other oppressed people's movements as well?
I mean, it's difficult to say because, unfortunately, I'm put it like this, unfortunately, the lesson that is taught out of the Palestinian struggle is resilience, smooth, steadfastness and resilience. But these are not the lessons, to be honest with you. This is a sort of soft approach to the Palestinians. It almost, in my opinion, patronizes Palestinians. In my opinion, it's a very patronizing attitude. Say, oh, the resilience of the Palestinians, smooth of the Palestinians. What is most extraordinary is the struggle. I mean, it's the capacity of Palestinian factions to continue to operate under conditions of occupation, apartheid, and genocide. I mean, the very fact that at the end of the bombardment, Hamas was able to emerge out of tunnels which were not destroyed and bring Israeli prisoners who look well fed and in decent medical shape. Yeah, that shows you their organizational capacity. I mean, there is something you got to say about how Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so on organize themselves. It is extremely, extremely incredible. I mean, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, their leadership is all in jail. And yet the PFLP continues to recruit, to build units in the West Bank, occupied Palestinian territory of the West Bank. They continue to struggle. They continue to fight back and so on. It's the organization of the Palestinians that impresses me. Resilience, steadfastness, okay, that's fine. But man, what's incredible is organization, is the fight back, is under conditions of extreme surveillance. You've built these networks, the resistance networks. I mean, the level of ingenuity and skill to create the tunnels. And it tells you something, that right till the very end, Yahya Sinwar, in that incredible Al Jazeera documentary, right till the very end, Mr. Sinwar is right there with a map, planning things, sending messages, and then, of course, he's getting, there's a drone and he throws a stick at it, one hand, if he didn't have any hands, he would spit at it, that's the resistance. That's not resilience. That's not steadfast. That's not smooth. That's resistance. That's different. That's the royal, you don't scare me, occupier. You don't scare me. I will fight you till the very end. That's something different. That's the lesson we must draw from the Palestinian cause. It's not somebody saying, well, my house is broken, we'll rebuild it. Yes, of course, that is amazing. But people do that all over the world, Barry. There's a flood, houses are destroyed, people have resilience. They come back and build their homes again. They don't all just die, okay? Resilience is not the main thing. And it's interesting that this is how people often talk of Palestinians, resilient, smooth. No, it's the resistance, it's the fight, it's the determination. You will not destroy me. You will not take my dignity away from me. I will fight you for my dignity. That fighting spirit, that's what we have to take away from this.
I think you just answered a much better question, which is what can the Palestinian struggle teach others rather than what are the lessons that we can learn from history. I really love that you highlighted such momentous moments over the past. And I just have to recognize that Khalid al-Jarrar from the PFLP was released, which was, great for us to see. I'm going to end with a question regarding advice that you can give young activists, because you've spent years analyzing and challenging global power structures, okay? So what advice would you give to activists who feel overwhelmed with the state of injustice today, but actually want to create meaningful change?
Well, the other day in London, I had the privilege of sharing a stage with Aleda Guevara. Dr. Aleda Guevara March, the daughter of Che Guevara, a great Cuban who went to Angola, as part of the fight against apartheid and so on. Tremendous person. She was asked a similar question by a young Palestinian, a young Egyptian who has been suspended by the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which has been behaving extremely badly towards young people who are standing up for dignity. At any rate, she said something. She said, patience, develop patience. But I want to give you some more words. I'll take her word, patience. I think patience is important. Patience is important, but also hard work. Read everything, study everything. Nothing is alien to you, absorb everything. You don't know things until you keep reading. I'm 57 years old. I don't think I know everything or anything, or I keep studying and reading and learning and talking to people and finding out things. I love being a journalist because it makes me, interested in other people's stories. Be interested in people. People make a difference. Not big, changes in the world. Big changes are made by people. Be patient, be kind, hardworking, and like people. You gotta like people. That's the important thing. You can't change the world if you are not a person who likes people. If you are, I have all kinds of words, but they're all slur words, and I'm not sure how risky I can be
Go
on your
ahead.
show.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just don't be an asshole. That's what I mean. Just don't be an asshole. Be kind. I mean, you can't change the world by being rude to people. Be kind to people, even if you don't agree with somebody. Even when you're trying to cut them to bits, be kind when you're doing that. There's no point being an asshole. It doesn't help us. We don't want a civilization built on that foundation. We want a kind, patient, hardworking civilization. And that's what we have to do now to start building it.
I love that. And have those deep conversations with people, like understand their stories. But I think we have a new tagline for Raw Politik, which is there's no point in being an asshole. So on that note, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. My pleasure. I enjoyed it as well. Thanks a lot.